The screaming woke Isaiah from dreams of Pennsylvania. Not human screaming, though he'd heard plenty of that in his 18 years at Blackridge Plantation, but the high, terrible shrieking of horses in mortal terror. The sound cut through the thick August night like a blade through flesh, and Isaiah was on his feet before consciousness fully returned, his calloused hands already reaching for his shirt. The heat was murderous. Even at what must have been near midnight, the air hung thick and wet as a burial shroud, pressing down on the slave quarters with suffocating weight. Isaiah's small room, barely large enough for the corn-shuck mattress and wooden crate that held his few possessions, radiated the day's accumulated warmth. Sweat already slicked his dark skin as he stumbled toward the door. Another scream split the darkness. This time Isaiah recognized the voice, Delilah, the dappled mare heavy with foal, due to birth within the week. His heart seized. Isaiah had gentled Delilah himself 3 years ago, had spoken soft words in her ear when Master Thornton Cade first brought her to Blackridge from a farm in Kentucky. She was intelligent, sensitive, prone to nervousness but responsive to patience. He'd been monitoring her pregnancy with the same careful attention he gave all his charges, checking her daily, ensuring she had the best hay, the cleanest water. Isaiah ran. The stable loomed ahead, its bulk a darker shadow against the starless sky. No moon tonight, just the occasional firefly winking in and out of existence like dying embers. The Cumberland River, invisible beyond the cotton fields, sent up its nightly chorus of frogs and insects, but that natural symphony was overwhelmed now by the sounds of chaos from within the stable. Horses neighing in panic. Hoofs striking wood. And underneath it all, something worse, human laughter. Isaiah's bare feet hit the packed earth of the stable yard. The doors stood open, lamplight spilling out in a sickly yellow pool. He should have slowed. Should have approached carefully. Should have remembered his place. But Delilah screamed again. He burst through the doorway and stopped as if he'd struck a wall. Master Thornton Cade stood in the center aisle, his silk shirt soaked through with sweat and whiskey, his face flushed the mottled red of a man 3 drinks past drunk. In his right hand he held a riding crop, the expensive one with the silver handle, imported from England, meant for show more than use. Beside him, swaying slightly, was Benjamin Cade, the eldest son and heir to Blackridge's 500 acres of cotton and sin. Benjamin was 24, broad-shouldered and handsome in the way that came from good breeding and better food, with his mother's fair hair and his father's cold blue eyes. He held a half-empty bottle of bourbon in one hand and a lamp in the other. Between them, backed into the corner of her stall, stood Delilah. Blood already marked her dappled flanks in thin, precise lines. Her eyes rolled white with terror, foam flecking her lips. She was trapped, they'd backed her into the corner where she couldn't turn or kick, where all she could do was endure. No, Isaiah heard himself say. The word escaped before wisdom could stop it. Thornton Cade's head swiveled toward him with the lazy menace of a cottonmouth coiling to strike. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, but the cruelty in them needed no clarity of vision. Well, Thornton drawled, his plantation owner's accent thick as molasses. The groom awakens. Benjamin, did you know we had an audience? Benjamin giggled, actually giggled, like a child who'd stolen a pie. Makes it more sporting, doesn't it, father? Isaiah's mind raced. He'd seen the masters drunk before. Had weathered their moods, their casual violence, their unpredictable rages. Had learned, as all enslaved people learned, to make himself small, invisible, unthreatening. But Delilah. Master Cade, Isaiah said, forcing his voice into the careful, neutral tone he'd perfected over years of survival. The mare, she's due any day now. She needs her rest. Perhaps. The riding crop whistled through the air and cracked against Delilah's swollen belly. The mare screamed. Perhaps, Thornton said, his voice suddenly sharp as broken glass, you forget your place, boy. Perhaps you forget that this horse is my property. That you are my property. That every living thing on this plantation exists for my pleasure. He struck again. And again. Isaiah stood frozen, his muscles locked in place by the terrible mathematics of slavery. Intervene and be beaten, or worse. Stay silent and watch suffering he had the strength to prevent. Every moment of his 30 years collapsed into this single calculation, repeated 1,000 times, always arriving at the same answer: survival meant submission. Benjamin took a long pull from his bourbon bottle and offered it to his father. She's a stubborn one. Like breaking a new slave, isn't it? They fight at first. Then they learn. Thornton accepted the bottle, drank, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes never left Delilah. That's the beauty of it, son. That moment when they understand. When the spirit breaks. When they realize they're nothing but what we make them. He moved closer to the mare. Delilah pressed herself against the wooden slats of her stall, trembling so violently her whole body shook. Her breathing came in shallow, panicked gasps. "Master, please," Isaiah started forward. "Watch," Thornton commanded. Not a request. An order. Benjamin moved to block Isaiah's path, setting down the lamp. Up close, Isaiah could smell the reek of alcohol and tobacco, could see the empty, glazed expression of a young man who'd never been told no in his entire privileged life. "Father says watch," Benjamin said. "So you watch." The beating continued. Methodical. Precise. Each strike was calculated to cause maximum pain without killing, because a dead horse had no resale value, and Thornton Cade was nothing if not economical in his cruelty. Isaiah watched. Had no choice but to watch. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, nails digging crescents into his palms. He counted the strikes. 11. 14. 23. Tried to be somewhere else, Pennsylvania, where he'd been born free before kidnappers dragged him south into this endless nightmare. Tried to remember his mother's face, his father's voice, the feeling of walking down a street without fear. But he couldn't leave. Not really. He was here, in this stable, watching a pregnant mare beaten for sport while her tormentors laughed. Then Delilah stopped screaming. The silence was somehow worse. She stood still now, head lowered, sides heaving. Something wet and dark spread down her hind legs, pooling in the straw beneath her. "Oh," Benjamin said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Father, I think." The foal came in a rush of blood and fluid, sliding into the soiled straw with a wet sound that would haunt Isaiah's dreams. It was small. Too small. And it wasn't moving. Delilah turned her head, trying to see, to understand. A low, keening sound emerged from her throat, grief in its purest form, species irrelevant. Thornton stared at the dead foal for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "Pity," he said. "That's $50 lost." He turned to Isaiah, and his smile was the cruelest thing Isaiah had ever seen. "Clean this up. I want the stall spotless by morning. And Isaiah? Remember this. Remember that everything you love, everything you care for, exists only because I allow it. And I can take it away whenever I please." He tossed the riding crop at Isaiah's feet. It landed in the spreading pool of blood. "Come along, Benjamin. Your mother will be wondering where we've been." They left, taking the lamp, their laughter echoing back through the darkness. Isaiah stood in the sudden silence. Around him, the other horses shifted nervously in their stalls, still spooked by the violence. The air smelled of blood, sweat, and fear. Outside, the August night pressed close, suffocating. He looked down at the dead foal. At Delilah, still standing with her head lowered, broken in ways that went deeper than flesh. At his own hands, empty and useless. Then he looked up. Through the stable doors, across the yard, past the overseer's cottage and the big house with its white columns, stood the plantation church. Small, neat, painted white as a virgin's dress. And through its open door, left ajar for ventilation in the heat, Isaiah could see it. The baptismal font. It sat on a raised platform behind the pulpit, illuminated by a shaft of starlight that had found its way through the clouds. Marble, imported from Charleston at tremendous expense, carved with angels and vines. Master Thornton was proud of that font. Boasted about it to visitors. Had his own children baptized in its holy water. Isaiah stared at it. At the pristine white marble, at the promise of purity and redemption it represented. At the symbol of a God who supposedly loved all his children equally but somehow sanctioned this hell. Something shifted inside him. Not broke, breaking implied something violent, sudden. This was quieter. Colder. Like ice forming on a still pond, one molecule at a time, until the surface was solid enough to bear weight. He knelt in the blood-soaked straw. Picked up the riding crop. felt its weight. The silver handle was engraved with Thornton Cade's initials, T.C. Isaiah looked at those initials. Looked at the dead foal. Looked at Delilah, who watched him with eyes that held an intelligence beyond animal instinct, a recognition of shared suffering. Then he looked at the church again. At the baptismal font gleaming in the darkness. Holy water, he whispered to the darkness. Purification. Cleansing of sins. Delilah shifted, her hoofs scraping against the stable floor. Isaiah stood. His hands no longer trembled. His breath came steady and even despite the heat. He knew what he would do. Not when, not yet. But how? And why? The font held perhaps 30 gallons when full. More than enough to baptize an infant. More than enough to cleanse a soul. More than enough to drown a man. He set to work cleaning the stall, his movements methodical and precise. As he worked, he planned. And as he planned, he felt something he hadn't felt in 18 years, not since he'd been torn from his free life and sold into bondage. He felt purpose. Outside, the August night wore on. The Cumberland River flowed past, indifferent to human suffering. In the big house, Thornton Cade slept soundly in his feather bed, his conscience untroubled. And in the stable, by the light of a single candle, Isaiah buried the foal and began to think about baptisms. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories, and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Sunday morning arrived dressed in deceit. The sky spread itself blue and cloudless over Blackridge Plantation, the kind of perfect August morning that made men speak of God's grace and divine providence. Mockingbirds sang in the magnolia trees. A gentle breeze, rare and precious, stirred the heavy air just enough to make the heat bearable. It was, by all appearances, a day blessed by heaven. Isaiah knew better. He stood in the slave quarters, buttoning the one shirt he owned without patches, preparing himself for the weekly ritual of enforced piety. His hands moved automatically through the motions while his mind remained fixed on what he'd seen 3 nights ago. The blood. The laughter. The casual cruelty delivered as entertainment. Delilah still wouldn't eat. She stood in her stall like a ghost of herself, and no amount of soft words or fresh hay could coax her back to life. Something fundamental had broken in her, and Isaiah understood exactly how that felt. Isaiah. The voice belonged to Moses, who filled the doorway with his considerable frame. At 45, Moses was the plantation's blacksmith, his arms thick as fence posts from decades of hammer work. Gray threaded through his hair, and scars marked his back in patterns that told their own terrible story. Time for church. Isaiah nodded. Around them, other enslaved people emerged from their cabins, dressed in their Sunday clothes, garments handed down from the big house, mended and remended until more patched than original fabric. Children were scrubbed clean, their hair braided or slicked down. Everyone moved with practiced efficiency, knowing that tardiness to Sunday service meant Monday morning punishment. They walked together toward the church, a silent procession along the dirt path that wound past the cotton fields. The bowls were opening now, white tufts emerging like accusations against the green. In a few weeks, picking would begin, dawn to dusk labor under the merciless sun, fingers bleeding, backs breaking, all to line Thornton Cade's pockets with profit earned in suffering. The church sat on a small rise, its white paint brilliant in the morning sun. A cross crowned its modest steeple. Through the open doors, Isaiah could hear the murmur of voices, the planters and their families, arriving in carriages, greeting each other with the easy warmth of people who'd never known fear. "Beautiful day the Lord has made," someone said. "Indeed. A blessing upon us all." Isaiah's jaw clenched. They entered through the side door, the colored entrance, separate from the main doors reserved for white congregants. The church's interior was simple but well maintained, wooden pews, whitewashed walls, windows that let in light but not air. The enslaved section occupied the back gallery, a narrow balcony where they could be seen but not heard, present but apart. Isaiah climbed the stairs, Moses behind him. From this elevated position, he had a perfect view of the entire church. The planter families occupied the main floor, the Cades in the front pew, naturally, along with the Wainwrights, the Beaumonts, the Ashfords. All the great families of the county, their wealth built on cotton and human bondage, their respectability purchased with blood. And there, positioned prominently behind the pulpit on its raised platform, stood the baptismal font. Isaiah stared at it. In daylight, it was even more impressive than he'd remembered. The marble gleamed, white and pure. Angels carved into its sides seemed to gaze down with benevolent expressions. The basin itself was perhaps 4 feet across and 2 feet deep, large enough for a full immersion baptism, should the occasion warrant. Large enough for other purposes as well. "Stop looking at that thing," Moses whispered beside him. "You've been staring at it for 3 days now. People notice." Isaiah forced his gaze away. "It's just a font. Nothing's just anything with you lately." Moses shifted his considerable weight, making the gallery floorboards creak. "What happened in the stables?" "Not here," Isaiah cut him off. Below, Reverend Silas Pemberton entered through the vestry door, his black robes flowing, his silver hair carefully pomaded. Pemberton owned a small farm 10 miles east, 40 acres and 12 slaves, whom he worked in his fields 6 days a week before preaching about Christian charity on the 7th. The congregation settled. Children were shushed. Hymnals opened. Thornton Cade sat in the front pew, his wife Constance beside him. She wore pale blue silk despite the heat, her blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls beneath a fashionable bonnet. Benjamin sat to his father's right, looking slightly worse for wear, the bourbon and late nights taking their toll. The 2 younger Cade children, daughters aged 12 and 9, completed the family portrait of respectability. Isaiah studied them. Tried to reconcile the image of Thornton Cade, upright citizen and church elder, with the monster who'd beaten a pregnant mare for sport. But there was no reconciliation to be found. They were the same man. The piety and the cruelty coexisted without contradiction in Thornton's mind, 2 sides of the same coin minted in a system that made men into gods and gods into demons. "Let us pray," Reverend Pemberton intoned. Heads bowed throughout the church. Isaiah kept his eyes open, watching. In the gallery around him, the enslaved congregants bent their heads obediently, some genuinely faithful, seeking comfort in the promise of heavenly reward for earthly suffering, others merely going through the motions, knowing that any sign of religious skepticism could be interpreted as dangerous rebellion. The prayer was lengthy. It thanked God for the harvest, for the community, for the natural order that placed some men above others. It asked for continued prosperity and peace. It never mentioned the slaves by name, referring to them only as those whom Providence has placed under our care. Isaiah felt something hot and bitter rise in his throat. The service continued. Hymns were sung, the white congregation below singing lustily, their voices rising in praise, while the gallery above joined in with harmonies that somehow made the same songs sound entirely different. Pain transformed the music, made it deeper, truer. Then came the sermon. Reverend Pemberton opened his Bible with reverent care. Today's scripture comes from Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 5. He paused for effect, his voice carrying easily through the small church. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Isaiah's hands gripped the edge of the pew. Pemberton continued, warming to his theme. "We live in a time of great anxiety, my brothers and sisters. Dark whispers spread through the land, whispers of rebellion, of unrest, of slaves who forget their place in God's divine order. But I tell you today, such rebellion is not merely a crime against man. It is a sin against the Almighty Himself." Thornton Cade nodded approvingly. Constance fanned herself, her expression serene. "The Lord, in His infinite wisdom, has arranged the world in a particular order," Pemberton went on. "Master and servant. Ruler and ruled. This is not cruelty, it is divine design. And those servants who faithfully fulfill their earthly duties shall receive their reward in heaven. Is that not a bargain of surpassing generosity?" In the gallery, Isaiah felt rather than saw the reactions around him. Resignation. Anger swallowed and suppressed. The particular exhaustion that came from hearing your oppression justified by the very God you'd been taught to worship. He turned his head slightly, letting his gaze drift across the other faces in the gallery. There was Ruth, 3 rows ahead, a house servant, perhaps 30 years old, light-skinned from some white ancestor who'd taken what he wanted. She wore a high-necked dress despite the heat, but Isaiah had seen the scars on her arms, the burns from when Constance Cade's jealousy turned violent. Ruth's eyes were fixed on the baptismal font, and something in her expression mirrored what Isaiah felt in his own chest. To her left sat young Elijah, barely 16, all sharp angles and barely contained fury. His sister Grace had been sold away just last month, sent to a plantation in Mississippi to settle one of Thornton's gambling debts. Elijah had screamed himself hoarse the day they took her. Now he sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight Isaiah could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. And beside Isaiah, Moses, steady, strong Moses, who'd been at Blackridge longer than anyone, who'd survived by keeping his head down and his thoughts hidden. But Isaiah saw how Moses's massive hands trembled slightly as they gripped his knees. Saw how his eyes kept returning to Thornton Cade's back, as if memorizing the exact location where a hammer might strike. The sermon concluded. More hymns. Another prayer. Then Reverend Pemberton raised his hands in blessing. Go forth in peace, he declared. Secure in the knowledge that you occupy the place God has chosen for you. Masters, rule with wisdom and mercy. Servants, obey with willing hearts. And may the Lord bless and keep you all until we gather again next Sunday. The service ended. The white congregation filed out through the main doors, greeting each other on the church lawn, making plans for afternoon visits and dinner parties. The enslaved filed out through their separate entrance, silent, returning to quarters for the brief Sunday afternoon rest before evening chores began. Isaiah lingered in the gallery, pretending to search for a dropped button. Moses hesitated, then followed the others out, understanding that Isaiah needed a moment alone. When the church was empty, Isaiah descended the gallery stairs. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. He walked down the center aisle, forbidden territory for someone like him, and stopped in front of the baptismal font. Up close, it was even more magnificent. The marble was cool beneath his fingertips, expertly carved, the kind of craftsmanship that cost more than a dozen slaves. The basin was empty now, but he could see the drain at the bottom, designed to allow the water to flow away after each use. Isaiah thought about water. About drowning. About baptism as death and rebirth. Beautiful, isn't it? He spun around. Ruth stood in the doorway, backlit by the brilliant morning sun. I shouldn't be here, Isaiah said automatically. None of us should be here. Ruth moved into the church, her footsteps soft. But here we are. She came to stand beside him, looking down into the empty font. I saw your face during the sermon. Saw what you were thinking. You don't know what I was thinking. I know what I was thinking. I suspect it's the same. She turned to face him fully. That mare. The one that lost her foal. That was you in the stables, wasn't it? You saw it happen. Isaiah's silence was answered enough. Ruth reached out, touched the rim of the baptismal font. Reverend Pemberton said we should obey with willing hearts. Accept our place in God's order. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. But what if the order is wrong? What if God made a mistake? God doesn't make mistakes, Isaiah said. Men do. Their eyes met. In that moment, understanding passed between them, wordless, complete. There are others, Ruth said. Others who feel as we do. Others who are tired of waiting for heaven when hell is here and now. It would be dangerous to speak of such things. More dangerous than living like this. She gestured around the church, encompassing everything, the font, the pews, the cross above the altar. They use God to keep us in chains. Use scripture like a whip. Perhaps it's time we found our own interpretation. Isaiah looked at the baptismal font again. At its pristine, gleaming surface. At the potential it represented. Next Sunday, he said quietly, there's to be a baptism. Thornton's grandson. Born last month to his eldest daughter in Nashville. They're bringing the child here for the ceremony. Ruth's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A family gathering. All the Cades together. All of them, Isaiah confirmed. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken plans hanging between them. Finally, Ruth spoke. Moses trusts you. So does young Elijah. If you were to speak to them. If you were to suggest. We should go, Isaiah interrupted. Before someone wonders where we are. But as they left the church, both of them looked back at the baptismal font one last time. In the slanting sunlight, the water stains around the drain looked almost like handprints, as if someone drowning had clawed at the marble, desperate for salvation that never came. Isaiah smiled. Next Sunday, he thought. 7 days to prepare. 7 days until the baptism. 7 days until the Sabbath hypocrites learned what holy water truly meant. The blacksmith's forge burned hot even after midnight. Isaiah approached through shadows, moving between the slave quarters with the practiced stealth of a man who'd learned long ago that survival sometimes meant invisibility. The August night pressed close, thick with humidity that made breathing feel like drowning in slow motion. Crickets sang their monotonous chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a hound bayed at nothing. The forge sat apart from the other buildings, too much fire risk to place it near the quarters or the big house. Moses had built it himself 15 years ago, under Thornton's supervision, and it had become his domain. Here, he shaped horseshoes and hinges, mended plows and chains, crafted the 1,000 metal things a plantation required. Here, he was valuable. Irreplaceable, even. Here, they could speak freely. Isaiah ducked through the door. Inside, the forge glowed red-orange, casting dancing shadows across walls black with soot. Moses stood at his anvil, hammer in hand, working on something that looked like a bracket. He didn't look up when Isaiah entered, just kept working, strike, turn, strike, the rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. "You're late," Moses said, his voice barely audible over the ringing metal. "Had to wait until Dawson made his rounds." Isaiah referred to the overseer, a mean-spirited man from Georgia who patrolled the quarters at irregular intervals, looking for any excuse to use his whip. "He's been suspicious lately. Watching everyone closer. Can't imagine why." Moses finally set down his hammer and looked at Isaiah. His face, illuminated by the forge light, was all hard planes and angles. "Ruth came by earlier. Said you two had an interesting conversation in the church. Did she tell you what we discussed?" "Didn't have to." Moses wiped sweat from his forehead with a rag that was more soot than cloth. "I've been watching you, Isaiah. Watching you watch that baptismal font like it holds the answers to every question you've ever had. I know that look. It's the look of a man making dangerous plans." Before Isaiah could respond, footsteps sounded outside. Both men tensed, but it was only Ruth, slipping through the doorway with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to moving unseen. Behind her came Elijah, his young face tight with nervous energy. "Are we safe here?" Elijah whispered, his eyes darting to the door. "Safe as anywhere," Moses replied. "And safer than most. Thornton doesn't come to the forge at night, and Dawson's afraid of fire. Says it's bad luck to disturb a man at his anvil after dark." He set down his tools and faced them all. "Now. Someone wants to tell me why we're having a secret meeting that could get us all killed." Isaiah stepped forward into the circle of firelight. "Because I'm going to kill Thornton Cade. And I'm asking for your help." The words fell into the forge's heat like stones into water. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled. The metal on the anvil cooled from orange to red to black. Finally, Moses laughed, a short, bitter sound without humor. "Just like that? You're going to kill him? You and what army, boy?" "Because last I checked, there are 50 white families within riding distance, a militia that drills every month, and enough guns in that big house to arm a regiment." "I'm not talking about a battle," Isaiah said. "I'm talking about justice. On Sunday. During the baptism." Ruth moved closer. "Tell them what you told me. About the font." Isaiah laid it out. Spoke calmly, methodically, the way he did when training a difficult horse, firm but patient, making each point clearly. The baptism ceremony would bring the entire Cade family together. The church would be full, but most would be in the pews, focused on the ritual. The baptismal font held 30 gallons of water. A man, held under, would drown in less than 2 minutes. Maybe less, if he'd been drinking, if he panicked, if multiple hands held him down. "The font sits behind the pulpit," Isaiah continued. "There's only one door to the vestry, and it's small. If Moses blocks it, no one gets through. Ruth, you'll be in the gallery with the others. When it starts, some will run, let them. But some will want to help. Guide them. Elijah, you're young and fast. Your job is the church doors. Once we start, no one leaves until it's done." Elijah's eyes were wide. "And you?" "I'll be at the front." Isaiah's voice was steady. "I'll do what needs doing." Moses shook his head slowly. This is madness. Pure madness. Even if you succeed, even if you drown Thornton and Benjamin and whoever else, then what? You think they'll just let us walk away? They'll hunt us down like animals. Hang us from every tree between here and Nashville. They'll do that anyway, Ruth said quietly. Eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. You know it's true, Moses. We're already dead. We're just waiting for them to finish killing us. She pushed up her sleeves. In the firelight, the burns on her arms showed clearly, circular marks, perfect and deliberate, made by the heated handle of a fireplace poker. Constance did this last week. Want to know why? Because Benjamin looked at me. That's all, just looked. And she decided I was getting ideas above my station. Ruth's voice shook, but not with fear. With rage. She heated the poker until it glowed, and she held my arms down, and she burned me while I screamed. And you know what Thornton said when I begged him to stop her? No one answered. He said, a master must discipline his property, and a wife her husband's property doubly so. Then he walked away. Ruth lowered her sleeves. I'm already in hell, Moses. At least this way, I drag some devils down with me. Elijah spoke up, his young voice cracking slightly. Grace was my twin. Did you know that? We were born within minutes of each other. Used to play a game where I'd hide and she'd find me, said she could feel where I was even without looking. He swallowed hard. She's in Mississippi now. On a cotton plantation twice as brutal as this one. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still feel her. Feel her suffering. And I can't do anything. Can't help her. Can't even say goodbye properly. His hands clenched into fists. I want to hurt them. Want to make them feel what Grace feels. What we all feel. Moses looked at each of them in turn. Isaiah could see the war playing out behind his eyes, caution versus anger, survival instinct versus the desperate need for dignity, for meaning, for revenge. You're asking me to throw away 15 years of staying alive, Moses said finally. I'm asking you to live, Isaiah countered. Really live, for maybe the first time since they put you in chains. Even if it's only for one day. 1 hour. 1 moment. The forge fire popped and hissed. Moses reached out and picked up his hammer, 8 pounds of iron with a handle worn smooth by decades of use. He hefted it, testing its weight, then looked at Isaiah. Tell me the whole plan. Every detail. Because if we're going to do this, we do it right. No mistakes. No hesitation. His jaw set firm. And no mercy. Relief washed through Isaiah, though he kept his expression neutral. Sunday morning, the baptism is scheduled for after the regular service. Figure around 11 o'clock. The baby is Thornton's grandson, daughter Margaret's child, brought from Nashville for the occasion. The family will be there. The Reverend. Probably most of the county gentry. How many white folk? Moses asked. 40, maybe 50 in the church. More outside on the lawn. Moses whistled low. That's a lot of witnesses. It's also chaos, Ruth interjected. A baptism, especially for a first grandson, means celebration. Food on the lawn afterward. People moving around. Attention focused on the baby, not on us. Exactly, Isaiah said. We use their joy against them. Let them be distracted by their ceremony while we prepare. Moses, you'll need to position yourself near the vestry door before the baptism starts. Make it look natural, maybe bring tools, say you're fixing the hinge or something. I can do that, Moses agreed. What about weapons? No guns. Too loud, too obvious. Besides, we don't need them. Not for this. Isaiah gestured to the hammer in Moses's hand. You've got that. There are heavy candlesticks in the church. And the element of surprise. Surprise only lasts a few seconds, Moses pointed out. That's all we need. Once Thornton's head goes under the water, once people see what's happening, there will be a moment, maybe 5, maybe 10 seconds, where everyone freezes. Shock. Disbelief. That's when Ruth guides anyone in the gallery who wants to help. That's when Elijah bars the doors. Elijah nodded eagerly. There's a heavy wooden beam kept beside the entrance. For storms. I can drop it across the door brackets. Good. Isaiah began to pace, his mind working through contingencies. Some will fight back. The younger men, probably. Benjamin for certain. The Wainwright boy, he's got a temper. We have to be ready for that. Let them fight, Moses said grimly. I've been holding back for 15 years. I've got a lot to express. Ruth moved to the forge, warming her hands despite the oppressive heat. What about after? Isaiah, you've planned the how, but what about the escape? Because Moses is right, they'll come after us. This was the part Isaiah had struggled with. The part that had no good answer. Some of us will make it, he said finally. The young ones, the fast ones. Head north toward the Cumberland River. Cross it, make for Kentucky, then Ohio. Follow the drinking gourd. He meant the North Star, guide for so many freedom seekers. Others. He trailed off. Others die, Moses finished. Or worse. Captured, tortured for information, made examples of. Yes, Isaiah admitted. And you? Ruth asked. Where will you be in all this? Isaiah looked at her, at Elijah, at Moses. I'll be in the church. Making sure it's finished. Understanding dawned on their faces. He wasn't planning to run. Wasn't planning to escape. This was his ending, not his beginning. That's suicide, Elijah protested. That's a choice, Isaiah corrected. For 18 years, I've had no choice. Every day, every moment, dictated by men who own my body. But this? This is mine. My decision. My action. And when they find me, when they ask why, I want to be there to tell them. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I want to see Thornton Cade's face when he realizes that the groom, the property, the thing he never even considered human, that I'm the one who sent him to hell. Ruth wiped at her eyes. There's poetry in that, I suppose. There's stupidity in it, Moses grumbled. But his voice lacked conviction. He understood. They all understood. This wasn't about survival. It was about dignity. About striking back at the system that had ground them down for so long. About proving, even for just one moment, that they were human, capable of choice, of action, of righteous fury. 7 days, Isaiah said. We have 7 days to prepare. To think through every detail. To make our peace with whatever comes after. I made my peace long ago, Moses said. He set down his hammer and extended his massive hand. All right, Isaiah. I'm with you. For grace. For Delilah. For every soul that suffered under these devils. Ruth placed her hand over Moses's. For the burns and the beatings and the years stolen from us. Elijah added his hand to the pile, his young face set with determination beyond his years. For grace. And for the chance to be free, even if only for a moment. Isaiah completed the circle, his hand atop theirs. 4 hands. 4 lives. 4 people deciding together that death with dignity beat living without it. 7 days, he repeated. Then we show them what baptism really means. The forge fire burned on into the night, forging more than metal in its heat. It forged resolve. It was a fake conspiracy. It forged 4 desperate souls into something sharp and dangerous. In 7 days, that blade would fall. And when it did, the blood would run thick enough to stain the holy water red. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Does the groom's plan have a chance? Sunday morning arrived with the mockery of perfection. The sky stretched endless and blue, unmarred by even the suggestion of a cloud. Birdsong filled the magnolia trees, sweet and oblivious. A breeze, gentle, almost apologetic, stirred the heavy air just enough to make the August heat bearable. It was the kind of morning that made believers speak of providence, of divine favor shining down upon the righteous. Isaiah knew better. He stood in the stable, his hands moving through the familiar motions of grooming even as his mind traced and retraced the plan. 7 days had passed since that meeting in the forge. 7 days of careful preparation masked as a normal routine. 7 days of watching, waiting, ensuring that every detail aligned. Delilah nickered softly behind him. She'd started eating again, finally, though something fundamental remained broken in her. She watched Isaiah with those intelligent eyes, and he wondered if horses understood revenge, if they grasped the concept of retribution. Soon, he whispered to her. Soon it balances. Isaiah. The voice came from outside, Samuel, one of the house servants. Master Cade says bring the carriage around. Families arriving from Nashville. Coming, Isaiah called back. He finished with the horses quickly, then moved to where the plantation's best carriage waited. It was an elegant thing, black lacquer with brass fittings, imported from Philadelphia at tremendous expense. Isaiah had maintained it for years, keeping the leather supple, the wood polished. Had driven it on countless Sundays to this very church. Today would be different. He drove the carriage up to the big house. The Cade family emerged in their Sunday finest, Thornton in a suit of charcoal gray, Constance in pale yellow silk despite the heat, Benjamin looking slightly hungover but presentable. The two daughters, Mary and Catherine, wore matching white dresses with pink ribbons. They climbed into the carriage without acknowledging Isaiah's presence. He was furniture to them. Useful, maintained, unremarked upon. Perfect. As they rolled toward the church, Isaiah could see other carriages converging from across the county. The Wainwrights, the Ashfords, the Beaumonts, all the great planter families, gathering to witness the baptism of Thornton Cade's first grandson. A child born into privilege, destined to inherit land and slaves and the casual cruelty that came with both. Not if Isaiah could help it. The churchyard was already crowded when they arrived. White families clustered in groups, the women comparing bonnets and gossiping, the men discussing cotton prices and politics. Enslaved people moved among them serving cold drinks, fanning their masters, holding parasols against the sun. Isaiah helped the Cades down from the carriage, then drove it to the designated area. As he did, he caught Moses's eye. The blacksmith stood near the church entrance, tool bag in hand, playing his role perfectly. Moses gave the slightest nod. Everything was ready. Isaiah joined the other enslaved people filing into the church through the side entrance. Up the narrow stairs to the gallery. He found his usual spot and looked down at the assembled congregation. The church was packed. Every pew filled with the county's elite, dressed in their finest, fanning themselves against the heat. Children squirmed, restrained by stern parental glances. The air smelled of perfume and sweat and the beeswax candles that flanked the altar. And behind the pulpit, gleaming like a promise, stood the baptismal font. Isaiah had filled it himself that morning. 30 gallons of clear water from the plantation well, blessed by Reverend Pemberton during the regular service. Holy water. Sanctified. Meant to cleanse the infant of original sin and welcome him into God's grace. Isaiah's hands gripped the gallery railing. In a few minutes, that water would serve a different purpose. Ruth sat 3 rows ahead, her posture perfect, her face a mask of serene attention. Only Isaiah, who knew what to look for, could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. Young Elijah was positioned near the back of the gallery, closest to the stairs. His role was crucial, he needed to be first down, first to the doors. The regular service concluded. Hymns were sung, prayers offered, collection plates passed. Then Reverend Pemberton raised his hands for silence. Brothers and sisters, he intoned, his voice carrying through the packed church, we have gathered today for a most blessed occasion. The baptism of a new soul into Christ's holy church. Will the family please come forward? Thornton Cade stood, his face radiating patriarchal pride. Beside him, his daughter Margaret rose, cradling a bundle of white lace and linen. The infant, barely 2 months old, was mercifully silent, sleeping through his own salvation ceremony. They processed to the front, the congregation watching with warm approval. Benjamin joined them, standing as godfather. Constance dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, overcome with grandmotherly emotion. Isaiah's stomach churned with disgust and anticipation. Reverend Pemberton took his position behind the baptismal font. Margaret handed him the baby, who stirred but didn't wake. The Reverend lifted the child high, displaying him to the congregation. I present to you Thornton Cade III, he declared. Born of good Christian stock, heir to a legacy of righteousness and Isaiah stood. The movement was subtle at first, easily dismissed. Just a slave shifting position in the uncomfortable gallery. But then Ruth stood. Then Elijah. Then others, one by one, until a dozen enslaved people were on their feet in the back gallery. Some of the white congregation noticed. Heads turned. Eyebrows raised. What? Reverend Pemberton started to say. Elijah moved. Fast as a snake strike, he was down the gallery stairs and sprinting for the main doors. Someone shouted. A woman screamed. Elijah reached the entrance and seized the heavy wooden beam kept there for storm protection. With strength born of desperate fury, he lifted it and dropped it across the door brackets. The church doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder. Now! Isaiah roared. Chaos erupted. Isaiah vaulted over the gallery railing, a 12-foot drop that he landed in a crouch, momentum carrying him forward. Moses burst from his position by the vestry, his blacksmith's hammer raised high. Ruth was right behind Isaiah, having taken the stairs, and other enslaved people followed, some eager, some terrified, all caught up in the moment. The white congregation surged to their feet in confused panic. Men reached for weapons they hadn't brought to church. Women grabbed their children and tried to flee toward doors that wouldn't open. Isaiah charged straight for the baptismal font. Thornton Cade turned, his face a mask of incomprehension rapidly transforming into rage. What is the meaning of? Isaiah hit him like a hammer blow, driving his shoulder into Thornton's midsection. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Thornton's carefully pomaded hair flying, his expensive suit crumpling. The congregation screamed. Get him off me! Thornton roared. Benjamin! Benjamin, help! Benjamin moved forward, but Moses intercepted him. 8 pounds of iron hammer swung in a vicious arc, catching Benjamin in the ribs. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the church. Benjamin went down, gasping, his face white with shock. Reverend Pemberton still held the baby, frozen in horror, the infant now screaming in terror. Ruth reached him, snatched the child from his arms with surprising gentleness, and passed him to another enslaved woman. Get the children out, Ruth commanded. All of them. This isn't about them. Some obeyed, gathering the white children and herding them toward the vestry door, away from the violence. Others, consumed by rage or fear or the intoxicating taste of power, moved toward the cowering planters with fists and stolen candlesticks raised high. Isaiah dragged Thornton to his feet. The master's face was purple with fury and terror, his careful respectability torn away to reveal the animal fear beneath. You dare! Thornton spat. You dare lay hands on me? I'll have you flayed. I'll have you burned alive. I'll. Isaiah hit him. Hard. Felt Thornton's nose crunch under his knuckles, felt blood spray hot across his hand. It felt like communion. 18 years, Isaiah said, his voice cutting through the chaos. 18 years you've owned me. Beat me. Worked like an animal. And now you're going to pay. He dragged Thornton toward the baptismal font. The master struggled, but Isaiah was younger, stronger, fueled by a rage that had been building for nearly 2 decades. Other hands joined his, Moses, leaving Benjamin broken and gasping on the floor, and 2 other enslaved men who joined the rebellion. They forced Thornton to his knees before the front. The holy water rippled, reflecting the chaos of the church on its surface. Baptism, Isaiah said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Cleansing. The washing away of sins. He grabbed Thornton's silver hair, jerked his head back. Let's see if it works. No, Thornton gasped. Please. I'll free you. All of you. I'll sign the papers. I'll. Isaiah shoved his head under the water. The effect was instantaneous. Thornton thrashed like a hooked fish, his hands clawing at the marble sides of the font. Water splashed out, soaking Isaiah's shirt, pooling on the platform. The master's legs kicked, his body convulsed, every muscle straining for air that wouldn't come. The congregation watched in paralyzed horror. Some tried to help but were held back by Moses and the others. Some simply stood frozen, their minds unable to process what they were seeing, slaves, their property, committing murder in a church, using the baptismal font as a drowning pool. Isaiah held Thornton under. Counted in his head. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The thrashing grew weaker. Bubbles rose to the surface, each one carrying away a little more of Thornton Cade's life. 40 seconds. 50. He pulled Thornton's head up. The master gasped, coughed, vomited water and bile across the platform. His face was purple, eyes bulging, hair plastered to his skull. "This is for Delilah," Isaiah said quietly. "For her foal. For every horse you broke for sport. For every person you treated as less than human." He forced Thornton under again. This time, the master's struggles were weaker. His body knew it was dying, and was already shutting down, prioritizing core functions in a futile attempt at survival. More bubbles. More thrashing, growing increasingly feeble. Isaiah held him under for a full minute. When he pulled him up this time, Thornton barely reacted. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. Water streamed from his mouth and nose. "Please," Thornton gurgled. The word was barely intelligible. "Mercy. Did you show mercy?" Isaiah asked. "To anyone? Ever?" He pushed Thornton under a third time. Final time. Held him there while the master's body gave one last, convulsive shudder, then went still. Held him there longer, making sure. The water around Thornton's head turned pink, then red, blood from his broken nose mixing with the holy water. When Isaiah finally released him, Thornton Cade slid down the side of the font and lay still on the platform, water pooling around his body. His eyes stared at nothing. His mouth hung open in a final, silent scream. Dead. The church fell into shocked silence. Even the screaming stopped. Everyone, black and white alike, stared at the impossible sight before them, a master dead at the hands of his slave, drowned in the very font meant to symbolize salvation. Isaiah looked up at the congregation. At their faces, frozen in horror and disbelief. He was soaked in water and blood, breathing hard, feeling more alive than he had in 18 years. "Who's next?" Moses asked, his voice cutting through the silence. He stood over Benjamin's moaning form, hammer raised. "Any other masters need baptizing?" Reverend Pemberton found his voice. "This is madness. Blasphemy. You'll all hang for this." "We're already dead," Ruth said. She stood near the altar, a heavy brass candlestick in her hand. "We've been dead for years. You just didn't notice because dead things still worked your fields." More enslaved people came forward now, emboldened by Thornton's death. They seized other planters, the Wainwright patriarch, old Judge Ashford, 2 of the Beaumont brothers. Dragged them toward the font despite their struggles, their pleas, their offers of money and freedom and mercy. Isaiah stepped back, letting others have their turn. He watched as Judge Ashford, who'd sentenced countless slaves to death or mutilation for minor infractions, was forced to his knees. Watched as the old man's face went under the water, as his body thrashed and stilled, as justice came slow and drowning. The baptismal font overflowed. Water sloshed across the platform, pink with blood, carrying the broken bodies of masters who'd thought themselves untouchable. The marble angels carved into the font's side seemed to weep, their serene faces now splattered with the evidence of retribution. Outside, Isaiah could hear shouting. The white families who'd remained on the lawn had heard the screams, seen people fleeing from the windows. They'd be organizing now. Getting guns. Calling for the militia. Time was running out. Benjamin Cade, broken ribs and all, tried to crawl toward the door. Moses caught him by the ankle, dragged him back. "Going somewhere?" Moses asked. There was no humor in his voice, just cold finality. "Don't," Benjamin gasped. "I'll give you anything. Money. Freedom. I'll help you escape." "You had your whole life to help," Moses said. "You chose cruelty instead." The hammer fell. Once, twice, 3 times. Benjamin's screaming stopped. Ruth stood before Constance Cade, who cowered near the altar, still clutching her handkerchief. The mistress who'd burned Ruth's arms with a hot poker. The mistress who'd ruled the plantation house with petty tyranny disguised as propriety. "Please," Constance whimpered. "I have children." "I have." "So did I," Ruth said quietly. "Before you had them sold away because you thought I was too pretty." She raised the candlestick. Isaiah turned away. Some things were too personal to witness. The massacre continued. Not systematic, there was no time for that, but thorough enough. The masters who'd gathered to celebrate a baptism became the baptized, drowned in holy water or beaten with brass and iron. Their blood sanctified the church in ways Reverend Pemberton had never intended. Some of the enslaved people used the chaos to flee, slipping out through the vestry door, heading for the woods. Isaiah didn't stop them. Some remained, unable to leave, too terrified or too enthralled by the violence to move. Some helped, settling scores that went back years or decades. Young Elijah stood by the barred doors, tears streaming down his face, watching masters die and seeing his sister Grace in every fallen body, imagining her suffering avenged, knowing it wasn't, knowing it never could be. The pounding on the doors grew louder. Male voices shouting. The crack of gunfire, someone shooting at the lock. Time to go, Moses said, breathing hard. His shirt was drenched in sweat and blood. Isaiah. We need to leave now. You go, Isaiah said. He looked around the church, at the bodies, at the blood, at the overflowing baptismal font with its cargo of drowned devils. This is my ending. Not yours. Don't be a fool. Go. Isaiah roared. Take Ruth. Take Elijah. Take anyone who'll follow. Head for the Cumberland, then north. Go. Moses hesitated, then nodded once. He understood. Some things were worth dying for. Ruth touched Isaiah's shoulder as she passed. Thank you, she whispered. For giving us this. Then they were gone, Moses and Ruth and Elijah and a dozen others, fleeing through the vestry door into the August morning, scattering into the woods and fields beyond. Isaiah stood alone in the church of the dead. He walked to the baptismal font. Looked down at the bodies floating in the bloodied water. Thornton Cade stared up at him with dead eyes, his expression frozen in eternal surprise. Baptism, Isaiah said to the corpse. Death and rebirth. You taught me that, in your sermons. You just never expected to experience it yourself. The church doors splintered. The beam holding them shut cracked under repeated impacts. They'd be through in moments. Isaiah knelt before the font. Dipped his hands in the water, holy and profane, sanctified and damned. Let the mixture of blood and blessing run through his fingers. When the militia burst through the doors, guns raised, fury in their eyes, they found him there. Kneeling in prayer before a baptismal font filled with corpses. His hands folded. His head bowed. Alive. Free. For the first and final time in 18 years. They came for him with rope and rifles and righteousness. The militia burst through the shattered church doors like an avenging host, 15 men in rough homespun and Sunday suits, their faces twisted with rage and horror. They expected resistance. Expected fighting. Expected the savage violence they'd been taught to fear from rebellious slaves. Instead, they found Isaiah kneeling in prayer. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. The words hung in the air, part curse and part prayer, as they took in the scene before them. The church was a charnel house. Bodies lay sprawled across the platform, slumped in pews, crumpled near the altar. The baptismal font overflowed with bloodied water and the remains of men who'd ruled this county like feudal lords. The marble angels wept red tears. And in the center of it all, serene as a saint, knelt Isaiah. Don't move. Colonel Marcus Wainwright barked, raising his rifle. His father's body lay somewhere in the carnage, Isaiah had lost track of which master had died where. Put your hands where I can see them. Isaiah raised his hands slowly. Made no threatening moves. Let them see he was unarmed, unresisting. He wanted to live long enough to speak. To explain. To make them understand what they'd created. On your feet, boy, Wainwright commanded. Isaiah stood. Looked each of them in the eyes, something no slave was supposed to do. Let them see he was human. Let them see he was unafraid. You killed them, someone said. The voice broke on the words. You murdered them. In a church. I executed them, Isaiah corrected quietly. For crimes they committed daily. For 18 years of theft, they stole my freedom, my life, my humanity. This was justice. Justice? Wainwright's face turned purple. You call this justice? This butchery. No more butchery than a man beating a pregnant mare until she miscarries. No more butchery than buying and selling children like cattle. No more butchery than building wealth on the backs of people you refuse to see as human. Isaiah's voice remained calm, steady. He'd prepared these words. Had known he'd get to speak to them. I call it balance. One of the militiamen, young, barely 20, vomited at the sight of his father's broken body near the font. Another wept openly. Several looked away from the carnage, unable to process what their eyes showed them. Where are the others? Wainwright demanded. The other slaves who did this with you? Gone, Isaiah said simply. Free. We'll find them. Hunt them down like the animals they are. Maybe. Probably. Isaiah shrugged. But for a few hours, a few days perhaps, they'll know what it feels like to choose their own path. To run toward something instead of away from punishment. That's more than you ever gave them. Chain him, Wainwright ordered. 2 men moved forward with iron shackles, heavy things, designed for the transport of human cargo. They locked them around Isaiah's wrists, his ankles. The weight was familiar. Comforting, almost. He'd worn chains in various forms for 18 years. They dragged him outside into the brilliant August morning. The sun was merciless, the sky still that mocking blue. On the church lawn, the surviving planters gathered, women and children who'd escaped the massacre, men who'd been outside when the doors barred. They stood in shocked clusters, holding each other, weeping. When they saw Isaiah, the weeping turned to screaming. Murderer! Devil! Hang him! Hang him now! The militia had to form a protective circle to prevent the mob from tearing Isaiah apart on the spot. Not out of mercy, they wanted him alive for questioning, for a trial that would serve as spectacle and warning. They threw him into a wagon. Rough hands, no gentleness. His head cracked against the wooden bed hard enough to blur his vision. Someone kicked him in the ribs, once, twice, 3 times. He curled into himself, protected his vital organs, accepted the beating with the same resignation he'd accepted 18 years of lesser abuses. Eventually, they stopped. Had to preserve him for the hanging. The wagon lurched into motion. Through the slats, Isaiah could see the church receding, that white building with its steeple reaching toward heaven, now housing hell within its walls. He wondered how long before they cleaned it. If they ever could. Some stains went deeper than blood. The journey to town took an hour. Isaiah drifted in and out of consciousness, pain and heat combining into a delirium that made him see things that weren't there. His mother's face. The Philadelphia streets of his childhood. Delilah, standing in her stall, whole and unbroken. They'd gathered at the town square by the time the wagon arrived. Blackridge wasn't much, a crossroads settlement with a courthouse, a general store, a tavern, and not much else. But news of the massacre had spread faster than wildfire, and people converged from every direction. Farmers left their fields. Shopkeepers abandoned their stores. Women brought their children, wanting them to witness what happened to rebellious slaves. The crowd swelled to hundreds. They dragged Isaiah from the wagon and chained him to a post in the square. Set armed guards around him. The crowd pressed close, spitting, cursing, throwing refuse. A rotten tomato hit his face. Mud followed. Someone's child threw a rock that opened a gash above his eye. Isaiah closed his eyes and waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed toward its zenith, beating down with August fury. No one offered water. No one offered shade. This was part of the punishment, the slow torture of public humiliation before the final release of death. Isaiah used the time to think. About Moses and Ruth and young Elijah. About whether they'd made it to the Cumberland River, if they'd crossed safely, if pursuit had already caught them. He hoped not. Hoped at least some of them would reach freedom, would carry the story north, and would let the world know what happened at Blackridge. By afternoon, the judge arrived. Not the regular circuit judge, Judge Ashford lay dead in the church. This was Judge Caleb Morrison from Nashville, summoned by emergency rider, authorized to conduct an expedited trial. Morrison was 60, white-haired, with the bearing of a man who'd sent countless slaves to their deaths and slept soundly after. They held the trial in the courthouse, but the crowd was too large. They moved it outside, to the courthouse steps, so everyone could witness. Isaiah was unchained from the post and dragged forward. They made him kneel on the steps while Judge Morrison sat above him on a chair brought from inside, a throne for dispensing justice that wasn't. Isaiah, Morrison intoned, sometimes called Isaiah Penn, belonging to Thornton Cade of Blackridge Plantation, you stand accused of murder, insurrection, and crimes against the natural order ordained by God and recognized by the sovereign state of Tennessee. How do you plead? Guilty, Isaiah said clearly. No point in lying. No desire to. A murmur ran through the crowd. They'd expected defiance or groveling. Not simple acknowledgement. Guilty. Morrison repeated. You confess to these crimes? I confess to killing Thornton Cade. To organize the revolt. To drowning masters in the baptismal font. Isaiah raised his head, looked at the judge. But I don't confess to crimes. I confess to justice. To do what any man would do when pushed past endurance. To claim humanity you denied me. Humanity. Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. You murdered innocent men in a house of God. There were no innocent men in that church, Isaiah countered. Every master there had bought, sold, beaten, or killed slaves. Everyone had built their wealth on stolen labor and broken bodies. Thornton Cade beat a pregnant mare to death for sport, then made me watch. Is that innocence? Silence. Morrison slammed his gavel. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not justify your barbarism with sophistry. But the crowd had heard. Some looked troubled. Most remained angry, but Isaiah had planted seeds of doubt. Had spoken truths that couldn't be unspoken. The sentence, Morrison continued, is death by hanging. To be carried out immediately, as an example to all who might consider following this path of rebellion and murder. May God have mercy on your soul, though you deserve none. They hauled Isaiah to his feet. The gallows waited in the square, a permanent fixture, used monthly for the execution of slaves and criminals. Isaiah had seen men hang from it before. Had watched their bodies dance at rope's end, had heard the wet snap of breaking necks. Now it was his turn. They walked him up the steps. Fitted the noose around his neck. The hemp rope was rough against his skin, already abraded from the chain collar. The hangman, a professional from Nashville, experienced in this grim work, adjusted the knot with practiced efficiency. Below, the crowd pressed close. Hundreds of faces, all watching, all waiting for death. Any last words? Morrison asked. The question was tradition, rarely granted to slaves, but Isaiah's crimes were too significant to ignore protocol. Isaiah looked out at the assembled multitude. Saw hatred, yes, but also fear. They were afraid of him. Afraid of what he represented. Afraid that other slaves might find the same courage, might rise up in a similar revolt. Good. I was born free, Isaiah said, his voice carrying across the square. In Pennsylvania. Kidnappers took me at 12. Sold me in Baltimore. I spent 18 years in chains I didn't deserve, serving masters I didn't choose, building wealth I'd never share. And in all that time, not one of you ever asked if it was right. If it was just. If God truly ordained one man to own another. That's enough, Morrison started. You asked for my words, Isaiah interrupted. These are my words. Remember them. Remember that the baptismal font ran red with Master's blood. Remember that slaves can choose violence as easily as you can. Remember that every kindness you withhold, every cruelty you inflict, every humanity you deny, it all comes back. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But it comes back. He paused, looked directly at Morrison. I killed Thornton Cade, Isaiah said. I drowned him in holy water meant for baptism. And if I had to live my life again, I'd do it the same. Because one moment of freedom, one moment of choice, one moment of being truly human, that's worth dying for. Silence fell across the square. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Then Morrison nodded to the hangman. The floor dropped away. Isaiah fell. The rope caught. His neck didn't break, the drop wasn't long enough, intentionally so. He strangled slowly, kicking, his vision going dark around the edges. The crowd watched. Some cheered. Some looked away. Some simply stared, memorizing the moment. It took 4 minutes for Isaiah to die. 4 minutes of choking, gasping, the world fading in and out. In those final moments, he saw things. Delilah, running free in a field somewhere, whole and unbroken. Moses and Ruth, crossing the Ohio River, touching free soil. Young Elijah, grown old, telling his grandchildren about the Blackridge Revolt. And the baptismal font, forever stained red, a permanent testament to the day the enslaved said no. The world went dark. Isaiah's body hung limp in the August heat, swaying slightly in the breeze. They left him there for 3 days, standard practice, a warning to others. Birds came. The sun did its work. By the 3rd day, he was barely recognizable. When they finally cut him down, they burned the body. Scattered the ashes. Tried to erase him from history. They failed. Because stories don't die with bodies. Stories live in whispers, in songs, in the memories of people who need heroes. And Isaiah became a story, told in slave quarters across Tennessee, passed from plantation to plantation, changed and embellished but never forgotten. The groom who drowned the masters in the baptismal font. The man who chose death over submission. The rebel who made holy water run red with justice. His ending was the beginning of something larger. Seeds planted in blood, waiting for the right season to bloom. And 40 miles north, in a cave near the Cumberland River, Moses and Ruth and 6 others huddled around a small fire, safe for the moment, and spoke Isaiah's name with reverence reserved for martyrs. He gave us this, Ruth said quietly. This chance. Then we'd better not waste it, Moses replied. They moved out at dawn, heading north toward freedom, carrying Isaiah's story with them. The reckoning had only just begun. 25 years passed like a wound that wouldn't heal. The year was 1855, and Thomas Garrett, journalist from Boston, abolitionist sympathizer, collector of stories the South preferred forgotten, stood before the ruins of Blackridge Plantation. The August heat remained as oppressive as ever, but the land itself had changed. Cotton fields lay fallow, choked with weeds. The big house stood empty, windows shattered, columns cracked. Nature was reclaiming what men had stolen. The church remained. Garrett adjusted his notebook and approached slowly. He'd traveled 3 weeks to reach this place, following rumors and whispered stories, piecing together fragments of a legend that had grown in the telling. The Blackridge Revolt. The Baptismal Massacre. Different names, same story, slaves rising up, drowning their masters in holy water, a rebellion crushed but never forgotten. He needed to know the truth. The church door hung crooked on broken hinges. Garrett pushed it open, and the smell hit him immediately, decay and mildew, wood rot and something else. Something that made his skin crawl despite the heat. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that pierced the damaged roof. Pews lay overturned, some broken for firewood by vagrants or vandals. The altar was bare, stripped of its brass fixtures. But at the back of the platform, still standing, still somehow intact despite 25 years of abandonment. The baptismal font. Garrett moved toward it slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The font was smaller than he'd imagined from the stories, just 4 feet across, 2 feet deep. But it dominated the ruined church with a presence that went beyond physical dimensions. The marble was stained. Dark marks ran down the inside of the basin, discolored patches that water and time hadn't erased. They looked disturbingly like handprints, fingers clawing, grasping, fighting for purchase against smooth stone. Around the rim, more stains. On the platform, shadows that might have been old bloodstains or might have been tricks of light. Garrett reached out to touch the font, then thought better of it. You feel it too. He spun around. An elderly black woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon. She was perhaps 70, bent with age but steady on her feet. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, seeing more than they should. Feel what? Garrett asked, his heart racing. The wrongness. She moved into the church with surprising grace. This place hasn't been right since that Sunday. Won't ever be right again. You were here. During the revolt. Child, I was in that gallery. She gestured upward to the narrow balcony, now sagging and dangerous. Watched the whole thing. Watched Isaiah drown Master Thornton. Watched Moses break Benjamin's bones. Watched holy water turn red as wine. Garrett fumbled for his notebook. Your name? Sarah. Just Sarah. Don't need more than that. She came to stand beside him, looking down into the empty font. You're that journalist. From up north. Been asking questions around town. I'm trying to understand what happened here. The truth, not the propaganda. Sarah laughed, a dry, brittle sound. Truth. Truth is complicated. Truth is Isaiah was a good man pushed past breaking. Truth is Thornton Cade was a devil in gentleman's clothing. Truth is what happened here was both horror and justice, and most folk can't hold both things in their heads at once. Tell me, Garrett said. Please. I want to get the story right. So she told him. About Isaiah, the groom who remembered freedom. About Delilah and the dead foal. About the meeting in the forge and the careful planning. About that Sunday morning when everything changed, the doors barring shut, the screaming, the drownings, the baptismal font overflowing with blood and bodies. I ran, Sarah admitted. Couldn't stay. Couldn't watch anymore. Made it as far as Kentucky before they caught me. But Moses and Ruth, they got through. Made it to Canada. I heard Moses lived another 15 years up there. Died free. Ruth too. And Elijah? Sarah's expression clouded. Caught 3 days after the revolt. Hanged in the square same as Isaiah, only slower. He was just 16. Baby-faced. Cried for his sister Grace at the end. Garrett wrote quickly, his hand cramping. What about after? The plantation, the families. Cursed, Sarah said simply. That's what folks say. Cursed ground, cursed church, cursed font. The Cade daughters inherited the plantation. Thornton's widow couldn't bear to stay, moved to Charleston and died within the year. Daughters tried to keep it running, but nothing grew right. Cotton came up stunted. Horses went lame in the stable. Workers, free and enslaved, refused to stay. Said they heard things at night. What kind of things? Screaming. Splashing water. Horses crying out in terror. Sarah touched the rim of the font, her weathered fingers tracing the stained marble. And singing. Slave songs. Freedom songs. Coming from this church when no one was inside. Garrett felt a chill despite the heat. Superstition. Maybe. Maybe not. Sarah looked at him with those sharp eyes. You plan to stay tonight? In the church? I hadn't planned. You should. If you want the whole story. If you want to understand. She moved toward the door. I'll be at the old quarters if you need me. But I won't come back here after dark. Not for money. Not for anything. She left him alone in the ruined church. Garrett spent the afternoon exploring, taking notes, making sketches. He examined the baptismal font from every angle, trying to understand the physics of how they'd managed it, how 4 enslaved people had drowned multiple grown men in such a confined space. The logistics of violence, clinical and detached. But as the sun began to set, his clinical detachment faltered. The church changed in the fading light. Shadows lengthened, stretched, took on shapes that seemed almost human. The temperature dropped, or seemed to, though August evenings in Tennessee were seldom cool. And sounds that might have been wind through broken windows, or might have been something else. Garrett lit his lantern. Settled onto one of the few intact pews. Told himself he was a rational man, a man of science and skepticism, not given to supernatural fancy. Then he heard the water. Splashing. Distinct, unmistakable. The sound of something, someone, thrashing in liquid. He turned slowly toward the baptismal font. It was empty. He could see it was empty, could see the dry marble, the stained interior. But the sound continued. Splashing. Struggling. And underneath it, muffled, desperate, screaming. No, Garrett whispered. This isn't real. The temperature plummeted. His breath misted in the air, impossible in August heat. The lantern flame guttered, dimmed, cast wild shadows that danced across the walls like figures in motion. More sounds now. Footsteps running. Doors slamming. Voices raised in anger and terror and triumph. The whole massacre played out again in ghost echoes, imprinted on the space itself. Garrett stood, his legs unsteady. Isaiah? The name escaped before he could stop it. Is that you? The splashing stopped. Silence fell, thick, oppressive, worse than the sounds had been. And in that silence, Garrett heard something new. A voice. Quiet. Steady. Speaking words he almost recognized. I was born free. Isaiah's last speech, whispered by the darkness itself. The words he'd spoken from the gallows, the testimony that had echoed across the South in the years since. 18 years in chains I didn't deserve. Garrett's hands trembled. His rational mind screamed that this was illusion, hysteria, the power of suggestion in a place soaked in trauma. But his body knew better. His body recognized the presence of something that defied explanation. Remember that the baptismal font ran red. The voice was closer now. Right behind him. Garrett spun around. Nothing. But the baptismal font, God help him, the baptismal font. Water filled it. Not pouring from any source, not flowing or splashing. Just suddenly present, as if it had always been there. Clear water, catching the lantern light, reflecting the broken ceiling above. And in that water, stains bloomed like ink in water. Red. Spreading. Until the entire basin churned with crimson. Garrett backed away. This isn't real. This isn't. Hands appeared beneath the surface. Pale hands. Clawing. Grasping. Fighting for air that wouldn't come. And faces pressed against the water from below, mouths open in silent screams, eyes bulging with terror. Thornton Cade. Benjamin. Judge Ashford. All of them, drowning again and again, trapped in an eternal moment of retribution. Remember, the voice whispered. Isaiah's voice. Remember what you did. Remember what we became. Garrett ran. He burst through the church doors into the blessed normalcy of evening air. Behind him, the sounds continued, splashing, screaming, the wet crack of breaking bones. He didn't look back. Didn't stop until he reached Sarah's cabin, where the lamplight promised sanity. She was waiting on the porch, unsurprised. You saw, she said. Not a question. Garrett collapsed onto the steps, shaking. The font. The water. The bodies. It happens, Sarah said calmly. Not every night. But often enough. Sometimes just sounds. Sometimes more. She handed him a cup of water. He couldn't bring himself to drink it. This is what they left behind. Not just bodies, not just blood. The moment itself, burned into the world so deep it can't fade. But it's been 25 years. Some things don't heal with time. Sarah looked toward the church, its white walls ghostly in the dusk. Isaiah died for what he did. Moses and Ruth lived with it. Elijah never got the chance to do either. But the place remembers. The font remembers. And maybe that's justice too, making sure no one forgets. Making sure the horror of slavery and the horror of the revolt both stay raw, both stay real. Garrett stayed the night at Sarah's cabin. Didn't sleep. Couldn't. Kept seeing those hands clawing at marble, those faces pressed against bloody water. He left Blackridge the next morning, his notebook full, his soul shaken. Returned to Boston. Wrote the story, carefully, factually, including the haunting but presenting it as local legend rather than personal experience. The article ran in the abolitionist papers. Some readers dismissed it as propaganda. Others saw it as evidence that slavery's sins would not be buried, that the victims and perpetrators both would haunt the nation until accounts were settled. 5 years later, the Civil War began. And in Tennessee, in a ruined church on abandoned plantation land, the baptismal font remained. Empty but never clean. Stained with marks that looked like handprints. Filled, on certain nights, with water that ran red. They tried to remove it once, in 1867, during Reconstruction. Brought workmen with hammers and crowbars. But when they touched the font, the screaming started. The water appeared. The hands clawed up from below. The workmen fled. Never came back. The font stands there still. The church collapsed around it in 1923, roof caving in, walls crumbling. But the baptismal font endured, marble and memory, symbol and grave, testament to the day enslaved people said no and masters learned what drowning felt like. Local children dare each other to approach it. Few do. Those who do report the same things Sarah told Garrett, the same things travelers report even now, sounds of splashing, glimpses of struggling figures, water that appears and disappears, always stained red. And on certain August nights, when the heat is unbearable and the air hangs heavy, they say you can hear singing. Slave songs. Freedom songs. And a voice, clear, steady, unafraid, speaking words that echo across time. I was born free. The baptismal font remembers. The ghosts do not forgive. And the water never runs clear. If this story sent chills down your spine, subscribe for more horrifying historical tales, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in a groom's position?